For decades, one of the darkest shadows hanging over modern medicine has been a single terrifying question. Did one of our greatest triumphs, the race to conquer polio, unleash the worst medical catastrophe in human history? A disaster that has claimed 26 million lives, infected 40 million more, and devastated an entire continent. Sounds like a conspiracy theory, a grim piece of alternative history, but what if it isn't? What if buried in the archives of a colonial medical lab and a secret chimpanzee camp in the heart of Africa lies the true origin of AIDS? This is a story not just of a virus but of a hypothesis that science itself tried to kill. A story of a hunt for the origin of a pandemic that led not to a remote jungle, but back into the sterile rooms of the world's most respected laboratories. The official story says a hunter cut his hand butchering a chimpanzee, but there is another, more disturbing theory. And to understand it, we have to go back not to the 1920s but to the 1950s, to a colonial capital called Stanleyville. Our public understanding of AIDS as an African hunter's accident begins to fray when you look at a simple timeline. The first documented human evidence of HIV was pulled from a blood sample collected in 1959 in Leopoldville, now Kinshasa. This is our patient zero in time. But what else was happening in that exact region at that exact moment? The answer is one of the largest, most audacious medical experiments in history: a mass vaccination campaign against polio. In the 1950s, America was recovering from a scourge that had haunted it for half a century. Polio paralyzed and killed thousands, mostly children. The race for a vaccine was a war, and its generals were scientific titans. One was Albert Sabin. The other was a brilliant, ambitious Polish-American researcher named Hilary Koprowski. They were fierce rivals, and to win they needed to test their oral vaccines on a massive scale. They needed a non-immunized population, a blank slate. Sabin made a secret deal with his native USSR. Koprowski chose a jewel of the Belgian colonial empire, the Congo. But here is where the story takes its dark turn. To make a polio vaccine in the 1950s, you needed one critical raw material: monkey kidneys. Scientists would mince the tissue into a monolayer of cells, incubate it with horse or calf serum, and then infect it with the polio virus. The virus would multiply in these living cells. The liquid was then harvested, filtered, killed with formaldehyde, and put into bottles. That was it, as one researcher put it. The problem was purity. As one virologist noted, you could look at a culture of monkey kidney cells and it would look clean. But if you look at those on the surface, you can see that there are other cell types present in there. And lurking in those other cells could be other, unknown viruses. The FDA and scientists knew this risk. A researcher named Bernice Eddy had her findings on contaminating monkey viruses suppressed early on. The terrifying SV40 virus, the 40th such simian virus discovered, was injected into millions via the Salk and Sabin vaccines. The system was aware of the danger, but the momentum of a global health triumph was unstoppable. It is from this flawed process that the oral polio vaccine hypothesis was born. Journalist Tom Curtis was the first to pull the thread, and later, a British journalist named Edward Hooper would dedicate 17 years of his life to weaving it into a 1,000-page accusation called The River. The theory is not that HIV was created in a lab. It's far more mundane and terrifying. It suggests that Koprowski's oral polio vaccine, called CHAT, may not have been made using Asian macaque monkeys, as was standard. Instead, it may have been grown on tissue cultures taken from a very different primate, the chimpanzee, the one animal carrying the direct ancestor of HIV. Why would you use a chimpanzee? The answer lies in a place called Lindy Camp. Koprowski's operation in the Congo wasn't just a mobile clinic. It was a sophisticated research hub, the Stanleyville Medical Laboratory. And just 15 kilometers downstream on the Lindy River, he established what would become one of the largest chimpanzee colonies ever created. Over 4 years, well over 400 chimpanzees were brought there. An army of 200 men, led by French hunters and local pygmy experts, performed some 120 expeditions. They killed the aggressive males and brought back the terrified females and babies. By early 1957, more than 100 chimps had arrived in just a couple of weeks. Photographs show Koprowski himself taking the ferry to visit, shaking hands with his colonial collaborators in the jungle. The question is, what were all these chimps for? The official answer from Koprovsky and his lead virologist in Stanleyville, Paul Ostriath, was always a hard no. The vaccine was never made in chimpanzee tissue. The lab was too primitive. Ostriath stated, "It never would have occurred to me to risk human life and my own reputation on material prepared under such primitive conditions." But the people who were there, the witnesses Hooper tracked down and we later followed up with, tell a very different story. Christophe Biello was 16 when he was hired at Lindy Camp. He knew its secrets. He led us to the camp's chief nurse for its entire life, Joseph Limbaya, who, after 48 years of silence, finally spoke. He had no hesitation. Paul Ostriath was the one giving orders. In a scene captured on film by a team member, we see the truth. Chimpanzees were not just held at Lindy, they were systematically sacrificed. Some were dissected alive to collect their blood and organs. The chief technician at the Stanleyville lab, Pierre Depaine, finally confessed on tape to Hooper that he himself prepared sterile tissue cultures from chimpanzee kidneys for Ostriath, a long time. But the most damning piece of evidence is a smoking gun hidden in a document. Gaston Ninane, a microbiologist on the team, was the first to meet Hooper. In his first raw, unguarded interview, Ninane stated it plainly. It was cultivated on kidney cells, on chimpanzee kidney cells. The kidney cell and the chimp multiply easily, and it was a good substrate for the polio virus. He later retracted this, but the original statement stands. Why would they need chimp kidneys? Because the virus in a live polio vaccine needs a living cell to grow in, and before it is squirted into a child's mouth, it must undergo multiple passages through fresh tissue. As Hooper explains, they didn't ship gallons of vaccine. They shipped a small flask, which was then grown up locally in locally available tissue culture. In the Congo, the locally available primate was the chimpanzee. This was the context of a confidential letter obtained from the time, stating that the massive Belgian Congo trial, spraying an experimental live vaccine into the mouths of 1 million people, was, in my opinion, an excellent example of how such large-scale studies should not be carried out. So, when this theory was brought before a special conference at the most prestigious scientific body in the world, the Royal Society in London, it was a showdown of epic proportions. Journalist Edward Hooper versus the scientific establishment. The meeting was co-organized by the legendary evolutionary biologist Bill Hamilton, who saw a 95% chance the theory was valid and feared a paranoid rejection from his own field. He had called for a true debate. He would not live to see it. Hamilton returned to the Congo to collect chimp fecal samples for DNA testing, contracted malaria, and died. His last scientific act was data collecting for a hated hypothesis, a final heroic commitment to the scientific method. At the Royal Society, Hooper walked in prepared to hand his data over if the theory was fairly disproven. He was instead met with a precast verdict. The conference's centerpiece was a dramatic announcement. A sealed sample of the chat vaccine from the 1950s had been located and tested. It contained no trace of HIV, SIV, or chimp DNA. Hillary Koprovsky was triumphant. There is no gun, there is no bullet, there is no shooter. There is only smoke created by Mr. Hooper. The OPV theory was declared dead. But here's the problem with that final blow. The samples tested were not the samples used in the Congo. The organizers themselves admitted the actual batches fed in Africa don't exist anymore. They were used. The tested sample was a different lot sent to a colleague, sealed and never opened. In all scientific rigor, it could not be the decisive proof. To this day, no vial of the actual vaccine squirted into the mouths of 1 million Congolese has ever been found or tested. As one critic noted, the scientists conjoined and had a public lynching in London. There are still great, gaping holes in their story. Yet, the hard evidence that seemed to win the day keeps shifting. The key counterargument that genetic dating proves HIV jumped to humans in the 1930s, long before the polio campaign, has itself been challenged by new studies. The molecular clock is not a stopwatch. It is a set of assumptions. The true scientific debate is not over. But maybe the real lesson isn't a final, neat answer. It's what this story reveals about the conduct of science itself. It's the suppressed warnings of Bernice Eddy about monkey viruses in the 1950s. It's the missing vaccine samples that a government researcher was told didn't exist when he came looking. It's the witness who gives one truth in an interview and a retraction in a signed affidavit. It is, as Bill Hamilton wrote in his final letter to the Royal Society before he died, a warning that through failure to find the truth, medical science will continue unheeding towards equal, if not considerably greater disasters. The easy story of a hunter, a cut hand and a spillover in the deep jungle, may be the correct one. Or it may be a story we prefer because a villain in the forest is easier to hold on to than a flawed hero in a lab coat. The true origin of AIDS might not just be a mystery of biology, but a cautionary tale about the very human systems we trust to solve our greatest crises. The line between a triumph and a catastrophe is often thinner than we think. And sometimes that line is drawn not in a forest but in a sterile room on a bed of minced chimpanzee kidney cells, by a researcher who has no idea what invisible passenger he just gave to a million people. Stay curious.